Member from Oshawa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite for the opportunity to speak to this bill, an act with respect to immigration to Ontario and a related amendment to the Regulated Health Professions Act 1991. I would also like to thank my colleague from London Fanshawe for her work as critic for citizenship, immigration and international trade, and for her thoughtful and poignant remarks on this bill when it was first introduced for second reading. And I would be remiss if I didn't recognize our NDP colleague and former critic, Michael Prue, who brought passion and expertise from this field into this legislature. Thank you to him for all of his work on the previous Bill 161. And now I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this bill today, a bill which has been a long time in the making. My region of Durham is growing and becoming more and more diverse. We have fruit and farm industry and opportunities for seasonal and migrant work. Our communities are growing and are expanding to welcome newcomers from around the world. Immigration concerns are by no means localized to any one area of the province. While I am pleased to be a part of this debate here in a multicultural centre like Toronto, I am glad to be able to bring voices we don't often hear from in this legislature. We are pleased to see the government moving forward on some portions of this bill, but as always, the process has taken too long and the scope is too narrow. What this bill is, Mr. Speaker, is a step in the right direction. In 2012, the government convened a roundtable of experts to review what changes and improvements were needed to Ontario's immigration system. The report they released, entitled Expanding Our Routes to Success, made 32 recommendations of changes the government could and should make, which would eventually inform the government's launch of a new direction, Ontario's immigration strategy. And from that strategy, we eventually come to the contents of this bill. So, Mr. Speaker, it has been a long road, and today we will talk about some of the things that made it into this bill and some of the things that didn't, what we feel are steps in the right direction, and what we can do to build on those first steps. I would like to start by looking at one of the recommendations made by the government's expert roundtable on immigration. Employers and communities need to be champions for the integration of immigrants. Mr. Speaker, this is a fairly broad statement, but its implications are significant. This bill acknowledges the importance of immigration to Ontario's economic future, but it does not properly address many of the fundamental challenges that newcomers face. Whether it is settlement issues such as ensuring that appropriate and affordable housing is available, or professional barriers such as the issues newcomers encounter with receiving accreditation in their field, we need to consider the whole process when we are making change. We need to have supports. The lack of necessary bridge programs, Mr. Speaker, leads to instability. Whether someone is an expectant mother, diagnosed with a disease, or a victim of abuse, newcomers in their first 3 months in the province lack the safety nets that otherwise exist for other Ontarians. In Quebec, there are policies in place to protect newcomers if they unfortunately end up in challenging circumstances. In Ontario, however, the lack of policy has a devastating impact on the lives of countless newcomers. Another concern, Mr. Speaker, is that this bill also doesn't do anything to close the existing loopholes when it comes to temporary and migrant workers. This means that this bill will do nothing to address the fact that migrant workers are immensely more vulnerable to exploitation and will do nothing to address the crisis of precarious employment that exists in general in our province. And this is not a small portion of the population, Mr. Speaker. In 2012, Ontario had over 70,000 migrant workers compared to fewer than 50,000 economic class immigrants that were granted permanent residency status that year. And typically speaking, the fastest growth of migrant workers has been in low-wage industries through the Temporary Foreign Worker Program. In 2012, over 17,000 employers applied for migrant labour through the Temporary Foreign Worker Program. And as all of us remember from the headlines, the Temporary Foreign Worker Program has not been a resounding success. Case in point, earlier this year, more than 150 migrant construction workers filed a lawsuit against Ottawa for discrimination under a program that permits them to work in Canada but allows only English-speaking candidates to stay on permanently. I'd like to read you a quote from Juvenal Cabral, a 48-year-old Portuguese-speaking custom carpenter from Açores, who is also one of the plaintiffs. Quote, "They did not require English to have us work here on work permits. When we wanted to stay, they said we needed to pass the English test to qualify. Why are we good enough to work here, but not good enough to stay?" End quote. As we follow this case, we should remain aware of its implications and work to improve the working conditions and living conditions for migrant workers here in Ontario. Hopefully, our actions in Ontario will give the Government of Canada the inspiration it needs to address these problems on the federal level. In 2006, a federal government review of the Temporary Foreign Worker Program acknowledged the failure of the program to safeguard migrant workers from exploitation, and a 2009 review of the Federal Auditor General also noted abuses and inadequate oversight, yet these problems continue today. Since migrant worker exploitation isn't a focus in this bill, I would like to focus on it here. In response to these issues, the Ontario Federation of Labour released a report in August 2013 entitled Labour Without Borders Towards a Migrant Workers' Bill of Rights. We know was also distributed to the government. The report analyzes the conditions that migrant workers experience in Canada and ultimately proposes a Bill of Rights for migrant workers to protect them from abuses and exploitation. I want to take this opportunity to read into the record the proposed Bill of Rights for migrant workers from this OFL report. Quote, all migrant workers should have the following inalienable rights: permanent residency and citizenship rights. The capacity for migrant workers to contribute to communities in Ontario should be recognized, and they should have access to permanent residency. Right to information. All migrant workers should have access to information about human rights, labour rights, workplace health and safety, and employment standards. Union protection and labour rights. Many migrant workers face the threat of being blacklisted or not being invited back to Canada again if they try to organize. As per the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the International Labour Organization Convention No. 98, all migrant workers should have the right to organize in a union and bargain collectively. Full benefits and health care rights. Migrant workers should have full access to social programs and benefits, including employment insurance, workers' compensation, social services, and settlement services, both by law and in practice. Migrant workers should also have access to health care. Employers are required to provide health insurance until migrant workers qualify for provincial health care. However, there is widespread non-compliance on the part of employers in fulfilling this responsibility. Freedom from recruitment fees. During recruitment, migrant workers are often charged exorbitant fees. This is entirely unacceptable, and employers should bear the cost of recruitment, which is a standard cost associated with running a business. Housing rights. Employers frequently provide or help migrant workers to find housing during their employment. Housing and living conditions are too often inadequate. Every migrant worker should live in a safe, sanitary, and comfortable living condition. Mobility rights. Currently, migrant workers' work permits are tied to a specific employer. Work permits tied to sectors or provinces would provide workers with more freedom of mobility once they arrive in Canada. And lastly, freedom from discrimination. All migrant workers should be free from all forms of discrimination, including racism and sexism. This should include equal remuneration for all workers, regardless of race, nationality, or gender." End quote. So you can see that there are things that could have been added to this bill and considered by this bill that haven't been. So, Speaker, these are not radical or revolutionary ideas. These are the rights that are naturally extended to us as Canadian citizens, but denied to migrant workers during the time that they spend in our country every year. We know that Ontario has been falling behind when it comes to the number of immigrants who arrive in Ontario, and we are happy to see some action from this government on immigration issues. But we need to be very aware of the fact that this bill does not address many of the fundamental challenges that newcomers face, nor does it reflect the typical low-wage migrant experience, or confer much in the way of protections. We would ask that during the committee stage, the government consider some of the larger immigration reforms that are needed, such as protections for migrant workers. Thank you again to the member opposite for the opportunity to speak to this bill today, and to my colleague from London Fanshawe for her work as the NDP critic for citizenship, immigration and international trade, and to the experts and stakeholders that have helped to inform all of our positions here today. There is a significant opportunity for the government to make some real and meaningful changes to Ontario's immigration system, and I sincerely encourage them to take it. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Questions and comments?